Hi guys, and welcome to episode 8 of Astrology with Anna. I'm Anna Ferster, and let's talk about some astrology. So for this week's episode, I wanted to finally kind of give a synopsis and give some examples of what the houses are, what they do, what they mean, what they symbolize, all that kind of stuff. So to start out, I am going to go over a really famous, to say famous is a little cliche, but like, I'm going to show you or go over more to say, because I can't show you, this is a podcast. Although there is video on my YouTube, so if you want to watch the video, check out my YouTube at Astrology with Anna, just like my podcast name. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over this famous kind of house explanation chart from Astrostyle. If you've seen a chart that has all the little all the basic meanings for each house before, you've probably seen this one from Astrostyle. If you look up Astrostyle houses chart, then you'll probably recognize it because it's been all over Instagram, Twitter. A lot of people use it as an example to really show the meanings of the houses, basic meanings and stuff like that. So basically what I'm going to do to start out with this episode is just go over each house, give a roundabout of my thoughts and also what they're saying, because they have a really good roundabout showing of the basic, like I said, themes of each house. So starting out, we're going to start out with the first house, also known as the ascendant, the rising, very famous, big three. That's, sun, moon, rising. That's just the first house. Each house in astrology is just the sign on the cusp of the number. So when you're on the first house, you see whatever sign, whatever number it's at, and that's your rising sign for the first house specifically. And then there's also other important houses, like the 4th house and the 10th house are also considered important, and then the 7th house is also considered really important. That's the descendant. But yeah, the 1st, 7th, 4th, and 10th are all considered very critical kind of house positions. And so that's why the first house is very important and considered one of the most important in your chart. And one of the reasons that it's that way is because it basically, your rising sign, your first house, kind of sets the entire tone for your entire chart. So when one of the first things people tend to see or tend to notice when looking at an astrology chart is, how important the rising sign is. What does it play in the chart? Is it at an important degree? What sign is it at? What's the chart ruler? That kind of stuff. This is, the important stuff an astrologer looks at. And so from Astrostyle, kind of the themes they bring up in the first house are self, appearances, beginnings, the body, first impressions, attitude, identity, and approach to life. A lot of people on social media will say that your rising sign or your ascendant is your mask. And I think it's an okay, explanation of what it means, but I would not say that the ascendant is necessarily a mask. I would more so say that it is the door to who you are, or the open door to who you are, depending on, I guess, your sign or how you express yourself. But it's kind of, it is in many ways the first impression to who you are, And so you can have a more closed off kind of first, first impression, or you could have really open first impression. Like I said, I think it really depends. Like I'd say for myself as an Aquarius rising, I would say I'm much more, it mainly depends, but I can be, both, although I tend to be much more closed off and kind of struggle with first impressions. But I think that's more of a Saturnian thing than anything else. Saturnian risings, people who have a Aquarius rising or a Capricorn rising, they definitely tend to either dislike first impressions or have a hard time with first impressions and need to practice it and definitely get better over time. But it all depends. I'd say if you're a Leo rising, you do a much better job for the most part at first impressions. You're much more open to, performing off the bat immediately. You're able to really show yourself really well. So it all depends. But like I said, I don't think it's to say something's a mask, I think is to say to hide, and I don't think people necessarily hide behind their rising signs. The way I always look at it is it's just who you are without thinking. It's who you are. It's the identity you've made up without making it up yourself. So it's a lot of learned habits. It's all the learned kind of things that you've gathered throughout your life. I think a lot of people kind of mix up the rising sign and the sun sign. I think the sun sign, which again, they kind of run in similar, circles, obviously, because they're two of the most important, but they are very similar because they're, two front-facing parts of your identity. But the sun sign is really about the sense of self that you've cultivated for yourself over your lifetime. And the rising sign is what you've built naturally around you and the front-facing identity that you have. Not as much the identity that you've cultivated for yourself and that you consider yourself as. I think that's much more connected when you have a sun in the first house, because when you have a sun in the first house, that means that your identity and the natural points to who you are, how you run, are in the same wheelhouse. So people who, like I said, have a sun in the first house, can talk and act and go into life very easily, very naturally, but also their sense of self is really one with just the front-facing world, dealing with life around them, rather than if you have a sun in the 7th house, then you find it very hard to just tie your sense of self with, the outer world, with being, very social and approaching life very with a steadfast attitude. You can be much more entwined in, relationships if you have a sun in the 7th house. And I can get back to that when we talk more about the 7th house. But I feel like, to me, the best way to surmise the first house and the rising sign is to just know it's not necessarily your identity, but it is how you walk through the world. It's not necessarily unless, like I said, it's in your first house. It's not necessarily, how you see yourself, but it is how the world sees you. And it is how you act, like I said, no matter if you see yourself that way. And so the next house is the 2nd house. So from Astro Style, their themes that they write out are money, work, income, daily routines, values, material possessions, priorities, habits, your job, and your work ethic. So I think the biggest thing here, in terms of the 2nd house, is money. But it's specifically money that you make yourself. So it's the money that you very distinctly work hard for, compared to the 8th house, which is considered to be other people's money. And, if you have planets in that house, or you have a lot of 8th house kind of energy about you, that means that you're able to kind of get money from other people rather than necessarily working hard for money yourself. And so the 2nd house very much so is about working very hard and, working very hard for your money, for your possessions, having a lot of very strong values, or just strong values about certain things, depending on what sign, or if you have an empty chart and it's not as important in your chart. Regardless, empty houses still have their importance. They just don't have planets in them, and so therefore there's not direct planetary influence besides, some chart rulers and some other kind of fun stuff. But you also learn a lot about kind of the ins and outs of your job and your work ethic, how you work. You see a lot more about, career and your workplace when you look at the 10th and the 6th house too. But here you see a lot of kind of how you value making money, your overall work ethic. So how it's easiest for you to make money, the ins and outs of, what you usually do to make money, what you do in terms of your work habits, what's your kind of daily work schedule look like. So for example, a person with Aries in the second house, they might be a very independent worker and like to make all the money they make themselves, or potentially be in some kind of leadership position where they're kind of in charge and able to run how things work. And so when you look at whatever sign is over your second house, and this goes for all the rest of the houses as well, you kind of learn best how you work within the themes of the second house, and how you can do best for yourself as well. So like if you just been having trouble making money or figuring out how to best work on your work ethic, if you don't have a strong work ethic or kind of value making money more, you can look at whatever sign, or even more so degree if you know a lot about degree theory, to understand what you can do about yourself to make more money. So if you, like I said, have an Aries second house, I would say make sure you're in a more independent position where you have a lot more leadership, or you're allowed to go off on your own a lot. Because, you know, if you're having to constantly be on a team or depend on other people in terms of your work and getting stuff done, you might struggle and you might potentially make a lot less money than you could, depending, you know, if you instead worked more independently. So the next house is the third house. From Astro Style, the themes that they put on here are the mind, thinking, communication, siblings, social activity, interests, neighbors, and early education. So I think, just from my point of view, the mind and communication are definitely two of the biggest ones here, especially communication, because it's telling you a lot about besides when you look at your Mercury, it's telling you a lot about your personal communication style. So the mind, I'm kind of just going over in my head, but when you see planets in the third house, you definitely see how your approach to how you communicate and how social you can be and how willing you are to connect with others on a communicative level. So if you have, say, a Saturn in the third house, you might struggle with really getting your point across, with talking with others, with just communicating on potentially any stage, or even in terms of school, like writing papers, doing homework assignments that have a lot of communication-based themes in them, stuff like that. Like when you're in college and you have to write a bunch of papers. If you have a Saturn in the third house, you might struggle with writing, but also pumping out paper on paper on paper. In terms of thinking as well, it kind of shows you, because Mercury tells you a lot about how you think and how you really communicate your thoughts to the other person or on paper. And so this does as well. It tells you how you really come up with ideas, what's best for you to come up with ideas, how to be more creative, how to best get your thoughts onto paper. You can really understand a lot of these things, of these themes in terms of yourself, by learning how to really best express whatever sign is over your third house. So if you have, for example, a Taurus third house, you probably want to be able to be in a very, like when I think of a Taurus third house, I think of someone who wants to be in a coffee shop or just be in a really nice, well manicured place so they can really get their thoughts out, to think, and really be able to, or just be able to feel like they can express themselves, right? Because Taurus and Libra, they like well manicured aesthetics. They like things that are beautiful. And so putting yourself in a space that's very beautiful can easily help you figure out better ways to communicate. That's just a quick example. The next house is the fourth house, and the fourth house themes include home, roots, family, self-care, emotions, foundations, the mother, children, women, and femininity. So the main house usually I think of when I think of the fourth house is home, or the family, or in other cases, your mother. Because those usually, for most people, especially in the United States where I live, or really just kind of across the world, are very connected. And so when you look at your fourth house, you can really understand a lot about your home life and how your home life went. Because when you look at the fourth house too, it talks a lot about previous things. It's not necessarily a lot of current things, although it can. But when you look at home roots, it's a lot of things that have already happened. And so when you're grown up and you're living life and you want to understand a little bit about how your family was or about how your family affected you and your life, you can easily look at the fourth house to understand that much more. So if you say have like a Gemini fourth house, you can easily surmise that you had maybe not so much of a chaotic household, but a very intense household where there was a lot of things going on all the time. There was a lot of communication happening. Maybe your parents are very talkative. Maybe your parents are very social people, or you just have a lot of siblings, or you just have, a lot of people in and out of your house, maybe more than, nuclear family members, aunts, uncles, cousins, that kind of stuff. I would say when you have a fourth house in Gemini, you might have a lot of cousins or have a lot of interaction with your cousins, stuff like that. And so, yeah, when you have, planets in, the fourth house or in any house, you can really understand how, say for instance, you have a moon in the fourth house, you can understand that you have a lot of emotions or are really emotionally attracted to your home, to maybe you have a very strong relationship with your mom or a very intense relationship with your mom, or you're just very tied to your hometown, or you consider yourself to almost be too attached to your home. But regardless, it kind of tells you a lot about, if you especially have a moon sign in there, being very emotional or being very tied to things in the past as well, being tied to things that have already happened and being very nostalgic. So like I said, if you have a Gemini over top of your fourth house, you probably are very nostalgic about very childlike things like playing, probably elementary school, because like a lot of play kind of happens on the elementary school kind of yard, I guess. But it kind of gives you a sense of what happened in your childhood, what happened at home, what home style was your home ran in. So like, was it like a very social household? Was it not? You get a good understanding, but also an understanding about how you also processed your childhood home, where you live, your family, your mom, stuff like that. So the fifth house themes include romance, love, affairs, play, creativity, fertility, childlike spirit, joy, self-expression, and drama. So when I think of the fifth house, I usually think of two things. Creativity, just overall, and then I think of romance. And so when you're looking at your fifth house, you can really understand how to best express your creativity, and probably, besides looking at your Venus sign, some of the best approaches to your love life, to dating, stuff like that. And I can also tell you a lot about your childlike habits as well. So what you can do to express maybe more childlike habits, or how you express childlike habits in general, stuff like that. So when, say for instance, you have, I'm trying to think of a planet, like maybe a Venus in the fifth house, which usually is a very positive position, you can express a lot of your creativity in terms of your love life, or just doing very Venusian things, like you probably enjoy doing makeup, or just doing something with a lot of kind of art tools. You could probably, I would say, like kind of going on dates and stuff like that. You could probably write about, in terms of creativity, you could write about romance, you could draw about romantic things. The fifth house is one of those houses where they have a lot of positives. There's a lot of positives compared to like maybe houses like the 12th house, which is considered to be there's no positive or real negative in astrology, but there are things that have more like karmic, I guess, debt to them, and things that, overall just end up more positive. And the fifth house just ends up more positive in terms of theming, because you're talking about, unless you have maybe a Saturn over it or maybe a Mars, in your fifth house, generally we're talking about very positive things. So that's the fifth house. The sixth house the themes include health, fitness, systems, analytical nature, pets, work habits, organization, sense of usefulness, and services given. So you can learn a lot about your workplace, a lot about how you organize yourself, a lot about, like I said, about how you do things, and also the best ways to do things when you're looking at each house. A lot about your pets too. If you have pets or you love pets, you can understand your own nature of dealing with them, or the best ways to deal with them when looking at the sixth house. So if, say, for instance, if you have, say, like a Cancer over like a Cancer sign over the sixth house, that probably means you do a lot of you like to do work from home, I would say, is probably number one. Or that you like to organize yourself in a very safe or comfortable environment, or you just like to work in a very safe and comfortable environment, or an environment that is very familiar to you and a place that you feel very safe in. And you, I would say, feel very connected to animals as well. Or if you have animals, if you feel connected to animals, that you most likely have some kind of emotional connection to them. You either like them or that you hate them. It's one of those things with Cancer, I think, as a sign, it's a lot about strong reactions, similar to like Aries, where it's like it's either one thing or the other. In terms of work habits, you can see what best ways you can organize yourself at work, how you can be most productive. You can look at whatever sign is over your sixth house and really understand what the best ways to deal with those themes are. And now the next house, which is the seventh house, or the descendant, the themes include relationships, marriage, contracts, business partnerships, equality, sharing, and interpersonal style. So probably the most well-known theme from the seventh house is relationships and marriage. Usually when people are looking at who they're most attracted to or who they would like to date, they're usually looking at the seventh house, because it does give you a really roundabout answer to who you really are attracted to. Because it very much, I would say, unless you have a lot of planets in there, or even just some planets, especially if you have personal planets, it can really show what you kind of lack and what you want in another person. And so it's why it's like the opposite of the ascendant. The ascendant is kind of unconsciously what you are, but the descendant, I don't think it's necessarily what you unconsciously want, but I think it's essentially what you're attracted to. And sometimes when you have a lot of planets in the seventh house, it can show kind of your attitude in life. And so when you have a sun in the seventh house, or say a Venus in the seventh house, you can be very dependent, or be very attracted to doing a lot for your partner, or kind of losing a sense of self in relationships, or losing, a sense of duty, or, if you have a Mars in the seventh house, you can be very dependent on working out and having a lot of your energy be from doing stuff with your partner, or doing stuff with only your partner, or constantly having to do stuff with others, stuff like that. So there's a lot of dependence, especially with planets, especially with personal planets in the seventh house, where when you have a bunch of personal planets in the seventh house, you kind of lose a sense of identity through, naturally being attracted to other people and getting purpose that way through other people. So when you look at the eighth house, the themes include merging, sex. Sex is a little bit debated. Some people think sex is more so entwined within the 5th house. Some think it's both. I think it's both. I think it's definitely a 2-part kind of theme. But sex, intimacy, shared finances, inheritances, taxes, loans, assets, property, joint ventures, goals, mystery, partners, and partners' resources. Or you could look at the, even bigger picture of everyone else's resources compared to your own. So what everyone else has versus what you make yourself, or what you have yourself. So I think when the 8th house, you usually most people would probably think of sex and death. I don't think they wrote death in there. That's another thing, that's very 8th house that I'm surprised they didn't put. But I also personally, like I said before, think of other people's finances. But I think death is kind of like a very interesting thing you can look at in terms of the 8th house, where you can really understand your approach or your viewpoint of death and your viewpoint of how you might die, or just your feelings about death in general, or about people in your life dying. And then it does talk about, like I said, other people's finances in general, shared finances. You can really understand the approach when you're looking at the 8th house, you want to try to make more money from the people around you, or get some kind of resources from the people around you. You have to look at your 8th house. So you have to look at what ways can you approach kind of getting a share of other people's kind of finances, getting a share of other people's resources, stuff like that. Because you'll see a lot of people who have placements in the 8th house are really very easily able to just get money from people, from the people around them. Just kind of, they are able to find a way when they need money to just get it from the people around them, compared to people who have a lot of placements in the 2nd house, or have maybe an North Node in the 2nd house. It's more their path to make everything themselves and not to rely on anybody for money. So when you're looking at the 8th house, you're really looking at almost a type of reliance on a certain amount of people to give you money consistently. So when you're looking at, say, like a Libra sign over the 8th house, you can see that you really have to form very intimate, or just very friendly and dependent connections with people, like consistent dependent connections with people, to be able to get money, compared to like a, say, maybe Aries 8th house, who has to remain somewhat independent, but also be able to lead themselves enough to garner that kind of money from other people. So depending on what sign you are, you might have to make more intense or much more connected connections, rather than, some people who have to make very thin but respectable connections to be able to circumvent money from the people around them. It all depends. And for the next house, we have the 9th house, which the themes include travel, wisdom, philosophy, higher education, law and religion, cross-cultural relations, learning, and ethics. So usually when I think of the 9th house, I usually think of travel and philosophy as their main points, especially travel. If you have planets in the 9th house, or maybe even a North Node or a South Node in the 9th house, you potentially travel a lot and get a lot of opportunities to travel, especially outside of your own country. That's usually a big thing. And so when you look at the sign over your 9th house, you can really get a grasp of how to potentially travel more, or the best ways to travel, as just an example. So for instance, if you have a Scorpio 9th house, you're able to really travel, or you're able to best get opportunities of travel through, I would say, probably, I have this sign, so I'm trying to think how I best travel. I would say alone, for one thing. Alone. because Scorpio is a Mars sign, so it's very independent. I would say if you have an Aries too, you're best traveling alone, independently, or at least in a place where you have a big leadership role. Scorpio, when you get to plan the majority, when you get to really plan your attack in terms of what's going to happen, when you're able to just be like, this is going to happen this time and this is going to happen then, and without much questioning from other people, especially if you're traveling with other people. And that's why it's usually best, to travel with less people or alone, because then you're able to really make up your own plan and then execute it to perfection, usually in Scorpio style. And then philosophy as well. It can teach you a lot about your personal philosophy, or how you may even, in terms of the 9th house, be religious as well, or spiritual. It talks a lot about spirituality and religion, but also just overall personal philosophy, where it's like you might be a more spiritual person, or you might have a lot more intense philosophies that you kind of have onto yourself that you believe in. While the 2nd house is really talking about values and what you value, the 9th house is your philosophy, just your constant, what keeps you going, what answers your sense of what is going on with the universe, what is the universe, what are we, and then also kind of your ethics. How are you ethical? Are you an ethical person? Are you not an ethical person? How do you look at ethics in general? Those are things of the 9th house. Those are, like, in my mind, as someone who's, studied for a while, kind of the bigger themes most of the time. So the next house, we have the 10th house, also known as the midheaven. So the 10th house themes include career, long-term goals, structure, status, reputation, public image, masculinity, men, fathers, experts, and fame. So a lot of people kind of put a lot of emphasis onto careers in the 10th house, which is true. I think it does have a lot of truth to that, but I think more so, you see, from what I've seen in terms of charts, I see a lot more emphasis on long-term goals, reputation. When you look at celebrities, especially public image and fame, those are, in my mind, the biggest points, because you really understand what the person wants long term, when you look at things long term, it's like how they put themselves, and when you look at goals, how they put themselves in the public eye. When you have a person who maybe has a Scorpio 10th house, they might be very unwilling to post on social media or be very consistent with social media because they inherently want to hide. Or maybe so, there's another side of that spectrum where they want to come off very mysterious. They want to come off very unwilling to interact with social media. But they could be interacting with social media as much as any person, but they are trying to cultivate an image that is very steeped in mystery. So there's kind of two sides of that spectrum, and you really have to be careful at reading a chart to understand which is which in a person's chart. Are they trying to cultivate a mysterious image, or are they actually mysterious and not willing to post or put any kind of public face in any type of way and have any type of public image at all? So the next house, and to go back to the 10th house, you can see a lot about your career because in many people's cases, a lot of their public image is tied with their career. But I think you learn a lot about your career as well, more so from the 2nd and 6th house, especially what careers, what kind of, again, your work ethic, stuff like that, your work habits. So the next house is the 11th house, and the 11th house themes include groups, friends, social awareness, humanitarianism, technology, hopes, wishes, and the future. So when I look at the 11th house, I definitely think of friends and groups and social awareness and humanitarianism. Those are usually the main points that I think of, number one. When you look at how you make friends, the types of friend groups that you have, maybe who you are attracted to most so in friends, you see all of those themes really represented in the 11th house. So if you're confused as to who the majority of the time, or the energy of the kind of people you make friends with, or the friend groups that you're attracted to, you can easily look at the 11th house to really understand and grasp those themes. And then you also see big time, social awareness and humanitarianism, your real approach to those themes. How in your own personal life, how you approach or how you view how you can be more socially aware and how you can, whatever version of humanitarianism or just social activism you're really attracted to. So, for instance, if you have maybe a Capricorn 11th house, I would say you're very attracted to concrete. You're really attracted in terms of social awareness. You might be very attracted to, really being involved in policy, especially if these are, a lot of these examples are even especially that I use, especially, more realistic when you have planets. So say, for instance, you have a Sun in Capricorn in the 11th house. I would say that you're probably very attracted to a very concrete perspective of humanitarianism and social awareness and social activism, where you actually look to have a job in humanitarianism or maybe just have a lot of passion for it and attempt to make policy in terms of social, I guess not social policy, but like in terms of your social awareness and how you look at humanitarianism. And so, because Capricorn is a sign of very concrete things, of making things, very real, but also very organized and very strict. And so when you have a Capricorn over the 11th house, they're really trying to, make things happen. Or sometimes they have a much more conservative view of something. This isn't, having a Capricorn over the 11th house doesn't necessarily mean that you have a conservative view of policy or politics, but it can show your approach to, or your, even so, more so your belief of how social or humanitarianistic things should go. So maybe you rather not, have more, maybe you're someone who isn't that attracted to social awareness, or maybe if you are, you're really into very concrete things happening, that policy actually being enacted, stuff like that. And the last house that we have to go over is the 12th house. Usually a very tough house to deal with, as I have learned throughout my life. But the 12th house includes endings, healing, closure, spirituality, solitude, karma, old age, afterlife, what's hidden, limiting beliefs, and the subconscious. So the 12th house is the house right before the first house. So it's basically what exists right below the surface. And I'll also deal, like one of the themes says, the subconscious and what's hidden from you. When I think of the 12th house, a lot of things I personally think of are karma, what's hidden from you, the subconscious, and things that are just naturally holding you back in life. I've known many people with Sun, Moon, Venuses all in the 12th house. And I can very honestly say they have made themselves their own worst enemy. Or a lot of the things that could make enemies, that could just, make enemies in their life, they're not able to actively deal with because they can't quite see it for what it is. There's a lot of secrets, or sometimes just secrets of the person themselves that they don't realize are secrets. So like, for instance, when you have a very, debilitating mental disorder and you're not able to quite get help from it or deal with it, that can be a 12th house theme where it's like, it's kind of hidden from you, especially people who don't, sometimes you see a lot of people these days who don't believe mental health is, or mental, disabilities are a realistic thing that happen with people, or you just see a lot of people who don't take mental disabilities or disorders very seriously. And so you can especially see a lot of pain and a lot of, sadly, like I said, secrets and very subconscious things happening with 12th house people. Like I said, mental disorders, mental disabilities, you can see. It's very obvious in the 12th house. And also, like I said, it's a very karmic house. So naturally things that hold you back and aren't things that you should be carrying into your current life. That's kind of how a lot of karma is looked at in astrology, things that are limiting you. Like when you look at the South Node in astrology, the South Node is a karmic angle. So when you look at, say, the South Node and their 12th or the 12th house, and or you can really look at things that are limiting you, that are keeping you from growing or doing what you're supposed to be doing in your current lifetime. So that's some quick summaries of the houses themselves. Now, when you look at the houses, each house has a ruler. So when you look at like basic astrology, you know, first house is ruled by Aries, second house is ruled by Taurus, or the first house is ruled by Mars, and the second house is ruled by Venus. But in each person's chart, you have a ruler. You have a planet ruler and sign ruler for, you know, every house, and it's all dependent on where your ascendant is, and then the ascendant therefore rules how each sign goes into every other house. So for me, my chart is ruled by, you know, Saturn and Uranus. I use both because I like, you know, traditional and modern interpretations because I'm an Aquarius rising. So like I said, I'm ruled by Saturn and Uranus. And so my first house sign is ruled by and is in, basically, I guess technically you would say ruled by a planet and it's in a sign. I kind of mix up the terminology sometimes, but it basically means the same thing, you know? The first house still is ruled by and, you know, is, you know, encapsulated by, you know, for me, Aquarius. But when you look at the second house, you know, you see, okay, you have a second house in Sagittarius. So your second house is ruled by Jupiter. And so when you look at each house, you want to look at not only what planets they're in, not only what sign they are, but you want to look at what planets rule naturally over each sign, because there's just natural rulerships, and you could look that up anywhere. I think I've previously talked about natural rulerships before. And basically what rulerships do is they just give you an even bigger picture. And this is how you can look at that. Say, for instance, like I said, you have a second house in Sagittarius, right? And so you're like, okay, Jupiter rules over my second house. So you therefore look at where Jupiter is in your chart. And so say Jupiter is in your 9th house. That means a lot of your work ethic, a lot of your personal job habits, and a lot of the way you work and the way you gain money comes from a lot of your personal philosophy and your personal ethics. So that's a quick way to surmise. And then you can be like, okay, your Jupiter is in, I'm going to give this random, this might not be accurate to the chart, you know, I'm talking for, but usually the second house in Sagittarius would have an opposite house of Gemini in the 8th house. So the 9th house might, say, be Cancer. So say you have a Cancer Jupiter, right? That rules over your second house. You might have a lot of a very loving and a very caring philosophy, or a very family-oriented philosophy, and a lot of ethics based in a family-oriented nature. And so you probably, in terms of how you make money, or in terms of how your work ethic, you might work a lot of hours because you want to make extra money for your family. Or you can look at it like you can work for your family. A big way for you to make money is to potentially work with family members or something like that, people who are very emotionally close to you. So that's a very quick way to use rulerships to even more so understand your chart overall. So that's a quick example. But that is it for this episode of Astrology with Anna. I hope this kind of gave you a better understanding about each house. And if you have any questions, I am going to have a mini episode answering questions coming out on Tuesday, and I'll be taking those questions on my Instagram at Astrology with Anna, and I'll probably put a poll up Saturday or Sunday night in which you can put out your questions. And I also have a poll going on my Spotify, I believe so, on my Spotify, where, you have a Q&A, and if you have any questions, you can put it on there. But like I said, if you have any questions, Instagram at Astrology with Anna, you can also leave a comment. And then my Spotify also has a Q&A. And then you can also follow me on YouTube at Astrology with Anna. And yeah, thank you for listening and or watching if you're on YouTube to this episode. And I will see you for the mini episode questionnaire on Tuesday. Bye-bye. Oh, I have an outro. I'm trying to think of that. It's been a while since I made an episode. It's been a minute. I'll see you in the stars in the next episode. Bye.